And just to stick with the schedule, let's start with the second paper presented by Marisol. A little about Marisol is she is a fourth-year PhD student in HCC at Georgia Tech under the advisement of Betsy, DiSalvo, and Neha Kumar. She's also computer science faculty back in Ecuador, her home country. Her research explores methodologies for engaging vulnerable groups in an asset-based design that challenges the inequities of large-scale systems. Today, she will present the paper Culture in Action, Unpacking Capacities to Inform Assets-Based Design, which received a CHI2020 honorable mention. So congratulations, Marisol, and over to you. Let's all welcome her.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Is everything good with the? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let me just start with my timer, and there we go. Good morning, or I guess afternoon for other. Well, yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for attending this session. I'm really excited for the opportunity of presenting this work on behalf of our team, and I'd like to start by walking you through the motivation for this research. And that has been our 4-year ethnographic exploration on how technologies can support the educational system in catering to the needs of Hispanic immigrant parents, specifically in the city of Atlanta in the United States. Now, historically, across the United States, it's been really difficult for Hispanic immigrant parents to work together with schools. Parents have so many differences from the norm, like their language, cultural practices, and even their long hour jobs, that it's super hard for them to keep up with school-related information. And then we also have the fact that educational systems tend to misread these limitations as parents' lack of care for their children's education. Now, across our work across 16 schools and organizations with over 300 parents, teachers, and decision makers, we've seen firsthand how the introduction of new technologies in the educational system only widens this gap. These interventions never consider these parents' realities, and thus they end up imposing practices that parents often reject, like keeping up with different messages from different apps and usernames and passwords. From the very beginning, the goal of our work has been to precisely change that. And so to do that, we've made the same commitment as Akash. We've been doing a commitment of embracing an assets-based process to design. So in spite of our work in community development, HCI scholars have increasingly proposed assets-based as a desirable approach when designing specifically for vulnerable groups. In essence, assets-based recognizes how vulnerable groups are rich in knowledge, skills, social capital, and other assets, and then proposes to work with these groups in designing technologies that use such assets to produce sustained change. Now, going back to our work, this assets-based perspective guided all our fieldwork, but after 3 years of fieldwork, we decided it was a time to engage in designing with parents. And so to do that, we conducted a 1-month participatory design experience with 35 parents across 3 of our previous locations. We worked with them in a series of activities that allow for them to identify, reflect, and discuss their assets, as well as their challenges in terms of different topics such as community building, information seeking, education, etc. And at last, we ended this whole activity with one that engaged them in designing with these assets in mind, while carefully trying to avoid scaring them off with technological ambitions. For this, we set up a parenting-related narrative using beloved characters from El Chavo del Ocho. This is a Mexican TV show extremely popular across Latin America. And then we asked parents to help these characters by giving magical attributes to everyday objects, such as a map, a pen, and a notepad, and many more. Parents then proposed and presented 13 design concepts using these objects. Now, I won't touch much on how we engage in this methodology. I'd like to invite you to read more about this in our paper. But the data that we collected was amazingly rich. And then we had to move on into analyzing the data to envision realistic opportunities for intervening the system, and then we had a problem. Our data highlighted what previous HCI work in assets-based design has already suggested, and that is that assets are not static traits, rather they're attributes that become assets given a particular situation. That is an asset, what is an asset in one situation can be a constraint in another. What we saw, for instance, it was parents saying that perseverance was one of the important assets they had, and then using it to pursue goals. And then we also saw that because of perseverance, they tended to over-focus and to dismiss other opportunities that were also important for them. We also saw in our data that the participatory assets-based design artifacts that parents had created were not always directly aligned with specific educational outcomes. In fact, they were more aligned with issues such as ensuring family togetherness and helping kids learn value-based lessons. And so this, we believe, prompts an important question for anybody trying to engage in assets-based design, and that is, what would be an appropriate methodology for unpacking participants' situated use of assets, and then informing technology-based interventions that make effective use of these assets. To define this methodology, we first looked at analytical lenses that could help us unpack actions as well as limitations. We looked at approaches within and outside SHCI, like for instance, activity theory and Bourdieu's theory of capital, among others. And none of them were appreciative of assets and limitations as the whole package. For instance, activity theory tends to downplay structural limitations, and then the theory of capital dismisses non-traditional forms of capital. So we decided to change our view and look into sociology. So we explored Swidler's theory of culture in action. And this is not a lens that has been used in ACI much, but we were drawn to it because it proposes that people are resourceful problem solvers. It also recognizes the ways in which people solve problems are not the same, cannot be, because they face structural limitations preventing them from acquiring the capacities to solve different problems. And so we took a deeper look into this theory, and we learned that it describes the way people act as a result of the many capacities that they have acquired as they interact with culture at large. So essentially, this theory proposes that each one of us has a cultural toolkit that we can draw from assembly strategies of action that help us face everyday problems without thinking too much. As these heuristics for acting become more prevalent in our lives, they actually start defining the goals that we pursue when we face a problem. So for example, when facing the problem of choosing teammates, a person who is really good at reading signs of loyalty will most likely try to choose teammates who seem loyal to him. This focus on capacities, and specifically on how we develop them over time, can provide us with more details than other approaches on the reasons why certain groups solve problems completely differently and use widely different cultural resources than others. Further, by not assigning value to people's strategies and capacities as more or less effective, this theory broadens our understanding of what assets can be. They no longer need to be only those productive traits that society values, like Bourdieu proposes. They can be much more than that. Now, what can this theory tell us about a possible methodology for analyzing assets-based data? Well, this theory clearly tells us that strategies of action actually embed much of the details of how and why action takes place. And so for starters, strategies tells us the real goal behind people's actions. If we can see the real goal, then we can better understand possible goals for design that are actually feasible for participants. How do we identify the goals from a strategy, though? So what we did with our data, which was very rich and very large, I guess, what we did with it is that we started the analysis by identifying parents' different strategies. We had many different. And then per strategy, we analyzed the problems that the strategy was trying to solve. Many problems. And then having one strategy and one problem in particular, we started to look at the capacities that people were using to solve the problem through that strategy and the limitations they faced. And it was only then when we had all this information about action that we could start to conclude the underlying goal that people were pursuing. So for example, in our data, we had that parents were often pursued learning for themselves as a very common strategy of action for them. An important question here is, why are they pursuing this strategy? It's not a bad one. It's just, why is this happening? Why this versus other strategies? And so what is the goal, basically? Analyzing all the instances where we saw parents doing this, we were able to identify the problems that they were trying to solve with this strategy. And one of those problems was basically the social discomfort that they feel by being in this foreign country. And so further analyzing the instances where they use this strategy to face social discomfort, we saw that they usually use the control of their space as a capacity, a desire to self-improve, an ability to find websites for learning. But they also fear a limitation in sometimes choosing these capacities, and that is fear to fail and embarrassment in front of other people when making mistakes. And so for this, now it became easier for us to see that the goal that parents were trying to pursue, it's that of safe self-empowerment. This means that of gaining self-confidence, feeling comfortable in this context in ways that prevent them from failing, that avoid the risk of failing. So in terms of design, this already tells us plenty. For example, when designing to support parents' learning processes, we cannot, definitely not enforce social components because that will probably scare them away. We first need to work with them in building their self-confidence before engaging in, attempting to engage them in any type of social learning. Now, let me walk you through the analysis of another strategy, that of parenting via consejos. Now, consejos is a word in Spanish that translates directly into advice, but that we saw entails much more nuances than that. Here we have the case of Clara. Clara's daughter recently had faced a bullying incident where some kids had called Clara fat, and the kids were very upset. So Clara used consejos to change her children's attitude. She sat down and had a long conversation with them where she explained how their family was in a better socioeconomic and probably emotional position than the bullies. And that thus whatever the bullies did or said did not matter that much after all. As this example shows, consejos are a strategy that addresses the problem of changing children's behavior through value-based elements. In this case, the notion of family togetherness and even classism to emphasize differences across families. Such mastery of using values for crafting consejos suggests that the goal here is to motivate value-based growth in children. And in the case of Clara, it meant to help her daughters feel proud of who they are. Now, what about education? In our data, we saw that a lot of parents were using this strategy to also change their children's academic behavior. However, in those cases, value-based discourse was not necessarily always enough. We have the case of, for instance, Regina and Roberto. They both were using values to convince their children of changing their academic behavior. Regina was using fear and guilt to convince her child of attending college. She was telling him, if you don't have a goal, you will not achieve anything in life. And then Roberto was doing something a bit different. He was bringing school-related examples when he was a kid at school and mixing it with value-based discourse. We believe this might have a little bit of a higher chance of attaining the goal that he was pursuing. Now, when we talked to Regina, she said that she actually would love to have the similar discourse and ability that Roberto had. She completely believes that mastering knowledge of how school works is important for impacting children's education, but she also recognized that wasn't as feasible for her. Her life experiences had made her an expert in value-based discourses, and her experiences with learning had been rather scarce and unpleasant, most related to her parents scolding her for not being smart enough, and finally taking her out of school to work in the field. With this knowledge, next question that we asked in our analysis was, how can technology have a role in supporting parents as they learn more school talk? And is there a way in which we can use the capacities of consejos to design such technology? To explore this, we turn to the parents' artifacts, the ones that they design. And as I hinted before, these were not traditional designs in the shape of sketches or storyboards. They were actually narratives of how certain objects could acquire magical powers to solve parenting problems of these beloved TV characters that I mentioned before. In this case, then the designs themselves represented strategies of action. So to analyze these designs, and I have some pictures there of what the designs were, we first grouped them based on the problems they were trying to solve. For example, we grouped together all the designs that address the problem of changing people's behavior. And from there, per artifact, we performed a similar analysis of what we did before. We looked at problems, capacities, and goals. And then when we had the design, we compare our new analysis to the previous ones relating to the same problem. Our goal was to see if there were any differences in capacities, limitations, or goals, because that will hint as possibilities in design for an intervention. So for example, our analysis identified the concept of pluma aspiracional, and this means aspirational pen. And this was one that related to consejos because it tried to change the behavior, but not the behavior of a child, the behavior of another parent. The concept proposed a magical pen and notepad that parents could use to write down their everyday activities. Like, for instance, I work more than 40 hours per week. The notepad would then react magically, showing the pros and cons of those activities for children's academic attainment. Like, for instance, if you work over 40 hours, the notepad would say, well, your child most likely not attend college. This is coming from the participant, not necessarily from me. Our analysis of this concept shows how, once again, parents try to grapple with academic problems through values. In this case, this concept was using guilt, fear, and aspirations is also family. The limitations are also the same. The parents have a little bit of a problem engaging in school talk. But when we compare this analysis to the other ones that we just saw for Fahina, etc., we see a new capacity here. That is a willingness to receive consejos on parenting from an impersonal technological solution. This suggests important intervention paths. It could be possible that parents could take advice from other parents if they come in the space of impersonal, in the shape of impersonal videos of parents they actually do not know. So there's no social commitment there. Other option could be an app where parents could ask questions about school and school talk strategies, and this app will then answer with value-based consejos. So with this analysis in mind, I'd like to end with a discussion of 3 implications that we see for this culture in action view to an asset-based design. So the first implication is basically the importance of looking at strategies of action. This lens has an emphasis on strategies of action and problem solving, and in doing that, it facilitates a holistic understanding of assets. Rather than assuming assets as positive traits only, this view forces us to ask way more questions about why participants act in a certain way, why they use some capacities versus others. It also forces us to realize that capacities might not always work as desired. We thus see assets from many other different perspectives. We also have a second implication that there are many more design opportunities that we can see when we look at capacities rather than assets. When we do assets-based design, we are looking at the assets and then we're trying to see how we can leverage the assets. But a view on capacity as imperfect elements, clashing with other capacities and limitations, augments possible design directions. For instance, if a capacity is not working, we will consider it as a valid, we wouldn't dismiss it. We will consider it as a valid aspect of the analysis and try to see why it isn't working and what we can learn from it. Also, seemingly negative responses like fear and distrust might actually also be capacities for solving the specific problems that these populations are facing. And then we need to know how to react to that. And finally, in terms of how to collect data on our capacities, participatory design is an excellent method. Although time constraints didn't allow me to go through all the methodology that we use, we still like to highlight 3 key qualities for a PD engagement that collects capacities. First, it's important to ensure gathering diversity of experiences, so assets from different perspectives and discussions. And then spend as much time needed in eliciting reflection. And finally, to scaffold participation through culturally appropriate imagination-based methods that actually lower technological ambitions. So that's it. That's a summary of what I just said. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marisol. That was really interesting. So now the chat is open for questions to Marisol. I see Akash has been answering all his questions in the chat box. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat box so Marisol can answer them.
Hi, this is Fernando. Can I ask a question through audio?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay. Hi, Marisol. That was a great talk. Very interesting. I had a question about the participatory design experience. Did you have the experience of having parents who were more skillful at creating artifacts in comparison to others? Were there any parents who were leading sort of the creation or, participating? Did you have parents that were not, that needed more help, I guess, from the researchers in order to produce artifacts or to produce data, I guess?
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Fernando. Yes, most definitely. This was a long assets-based engagement. And so we had a lot of moments for design. The last moment of design was the one that was going to create ideas for the future. But in general, they were always creating artifacts. And we had cases where parents didn't feel comfortable writing. That is it's by the book. And they would just stop working. You have to sit down with them and in a way that wouldn't make them feel embarrassed, try to work with them. So that happened in terms of just not wanting to, but being willing to engage in conversation, just not wanting to engage in writing. That's the reason why we decided not to do storyboards, for instance, right? Because we didn't see it feasible. In terms of design, there were parents that had an easier time with imagination. Imagination in general, like if somebody says, imagine, you're like, And even though this was more of a playful environment, etc., still there were some parents who were like, I need to imagine how this is going to become magic. I don't fully understand. Why don't we just use Facebook? And so we had to engage in conversations with the entire group, actually. When a parent took it a little bit over, what I tried to do was to engage in more asking questions to the other parents to see what they thought of the ideas that the other parents were having. But yeah, it certainly happens that there's an equal distribution of capacities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question by Wendy. If you want to ask through audio, that'd be fine.
Yeah, thank you for your talk, Marisol. I was wondering, in the framework that you presented, it seemed like the end goal at the bottom of your diagrams were the parent goals. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the opportunities or tensions between the parent goals that you identified with systemic education formal goals, and how they oppress students of color.
That is a whole paper that I need to write, because all these things that were, we saw so many things interesting. For instance, parents, after all this thing, parents, if you want to engage them, like I said, you cannot like push them into, let's come and be a volunteer, because that already is pushing for this social commitment that they don't want to engage. They want to learn, but like individually. So we found that maybe if we keep like asking them to help little by little, maybe remotely, like give me an image, show me, like give me a link, and then we keep increasing their commitment, maybe we'll have more of their participation. That will require for schools to change the entire volunteering system that they have. And schools have a very interesting, for me, since I'm not from here, everything has been like a grown learning experience, that schools don't want to show preference towards vulnerable groups or any group, because then the people who have the money will say, why aren't you catering my needs too? Why are you catering only their needs? So changing the volunteering system to cater the needs of parents, like Hispanic immigrant parents, is a complicated thing. So our next step is to gather all these findings, well, was before COVID, all these findings, and take and engage in presentations with the school district, with different school districts, and even with the mayor of one of the locations. So we wanted to scale up to see the feasibility of changing the system entirely, or bit by bit, like Akash said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks, Marisol. So I think this is the end of session 2, and thank you all for joining us, and all the speakers for being so patient and your time and effort in this presentation. Thank you so much, and have a nice weekend.